Hi everyone, my name is Sarah Mari. I'm one of the librarians at Portland Public Library in Portland, Maine, and I'm here to continue reading The Reptile Room, the second book in a series of unfortunate events written by Lemony Snicket, illustrated by Brett Helquist, and published by Harper Collins Publishers. We're going to pick up where we left off with Chapter 9, with the Baudelaire orphans once again in a precarious and unpleasant position. Chapter 9. When Violet opened the enormous door of the Reptile Room, the cages were still closed, the books were still on the shelves, and the morning sun was still streaming through the glass walls. But the place simply wasn't the same. Even though Dr. Lucafont had removed Uncle Monty's body, the Reptile Room was not as inviting as it used to be, and probably never would be. What happens in a certain place can stain your feelings for that location, just as ink can stain a white sheet. You can wash it, and still will never forget what has transpired, a word which here means what happened and made everybody sad. I don't want to go in, Klaus said. Uncle Monty died in here. I know we don't want to be here, Violet said, but we have work to do. Work? Klaus asked. What work? Violet gritted her teeth. We have work to do, she said, that Mr. Poe should be doing, but as usual he is well-intentioned, but of no real help. Klaus and Sunny sighed as she spoke out loud, a sentiment that all three siblings had never said but always felt, since Mr. Poe had taken over their affairs. Mr. Poe doesn't believe that Stefano and Count Olaf are the same person, and he believes that Uncle Monty's death was an accident. We have to prove him wrong on both accounts. But Stefano doesn't have the tattoo, Klaus pointed out, and Dr. Lucafont found the venom of the Mamba Jamal in Monty's veins. I know, Violet said impatiently. The three of us know the truth, but in order to convince the adults, we have to find evidence and proof of Stefano's plan. If only we'd found evidence and proof earlier, Klaus said glumly, then maybe we could have saved Uncle Monty's life. We'll never know about that, Violet said quietly. She looked around the Reptile Room, which Monty had worked on his whole life. But if we put Stefano behind bars for his murder, we'll at least be able to prevent him from harming anyone else. Including us, Klaus pointed out. Including us, Violet agreed. Now, Klaus, find all of Uncle Monty's books that might contain information about the Mamba Jamal. Let me know if you find anything. But all that research could take days, Klaus said, looking at Monty's considerable library. Well, we don't have days, Violet said firmly. We don't even have hours. At 5 o'clock, the Prospero leaves Hazy Harbor, and Stefano is going to do everything he can to make sure that we are on that ship. And if we end up alone in Peru with him... All right, Klaus said. Let's get started. Here, you take this book. I'm not taking any book, Violet said. While you're in the library, I'm going to go to Stefano's room to see if I can find any clues. Alone? Klaus asked. In his room? It'll be perfectly safe, Violet said, although she knew nothing of the kind. Get cracking with the books, Klaus. Sunny, watch the door and bite anyone who tries to get in. Ackroyd, Sunny said, which probably meant something like Roger. Violet left, and true to her word, Sunny sat near the door with her teeth bared. Klaus walked to the far end of the room where the library was, carefully avoiding the aisle where the poisonous snakes were kept. He didn't even want to look at the Mamba Jamal or any other deadly reptile. Even though Klaus knew that Uncle Monty's death was the fault of Stefano, and not really of the snake, he couldn't bear to look at the reptile who had put an end to the happy times he and his sisters had enjoyed. Klaus sighed and opened a book, and as at so many other times when the middle Baudelaire child did not want to think about his circumstances, he began to read. Now, it is not necessary for me to use the rather hackneyed phrase, meanwhile back at the ranch. The word hackney here means used by so many other writers, but by the time Lemony Snicket uses it, it is a tiresome cliche. Meanwhile back at the ranch is a phrase used to link what is going on in one part of the story to what's going on in another part of the story. And it has nothing to do with cows or horses or with any people who work in rural areas where ranches are, or even with ranch dressing, which is creamy and put on salads. Here the phrase, meanwhile back at the ranch, refers to what Violet was doing while Klaus and Sunny were in the Reptile Room. First, Klaus began to read in Uncle Monty's library, and Sunny guarded the door with her sharp teeth. Violet was up to something I'm sure will be of interest to you. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, Violet went to listen to the kitchen door, trying to catch what the adults are saying. As I'm sure you know, the key to good eavesdropping is not getting caught, and Violet moved as quietly as she could, trying not to step on any creaky parts of the floor. When she reached the door of the kitchen, she took her hair ribbon out of her pocket and dropped it on the floor, so if anyone opened the door, she could claim that she was kneeling down to pick it up, rather than to eavesdrop. This was a trick that she had learned when she was very small, when she would listen at her parents' bedroom door to hear what they might be planning for her birthday, and, like all good tricks, it still worked. But Mr. Poe, if Stefano rides with me in my car and you drive in Dr. Montgomery's Jeep, Dr. Lucafont was saying, then how will you know the way? I see your point, Mr. Poe said, but I don't think that Sonny will be willing to sit on Dr. Montgomery's lap if he's dead. We will have to work out another way. I've got it, Stefano said. I will drive the children in Dr. Lucafont's car, and Dr. Lucafont can go with you and Dr. Montgomery in Dr. Montgomery's Jeeps. I'm afraid that won't work, Dr. Lucafont said gravely. The city laws won't allow anyone else to drive my car. And we haven't even discussed the issue of the children's luggage, Mr. Poe said. Violet stood up, having heard enough to know that she had enough time to go up to Stefano's room. Quietly, Violet walked up the stairs and down the hallway towards Stefano's door, where he had sat holding the knife that fearsome night. When she reached his door, Violet stopped. It was amazing, she thought, how everything to do with Count Olaf was frightening. He was such a terrible person that merely the sight of his bedroom door could get her heart pounding. Violet found herself half hoping that Stefano would bound up the stairs and stop her just so she wouldn't have to open this door and go in the room where he had slept. But then Violet thought of her own safety and the safety of her two siblings. If one's safety is threatened, one often finds courage one didn't know one had, and the eldest Baudelaire found that she could be brave enough to open the door. Her shoulders still ached from the car collision as Violet turned the brass handle of the door and walked inside. The room, as Violet suspected, was a dirty mess. The bed was unmade and had cracker crumbs and bits of hair all over it. Discarded newspapers and mail-order catalogs lay on the floor in untidy piles. On top of the dresser was a small assortment of half-empty wine bottles. The closet door was open, revealing a bunch of rusty wire coat hangers that shivered in the drafty room. The curtains over the window were all bunched up and encrusted with something flaky, and as Violet drew closer, she realized with a faint horror that Stefano had blown his nose on them. Although it was a disgusting hardened phlegm, and not the sort of evidence that Violet was hoping for. The eldest Baudelaire orphan stood in the center of the room and surveyed the sticky disorder of the bedroom. Everything was horrendous. Nothing was helpful. Violet rubbed her sore shoulder and remembered when she and her siblings were living with Count Olaf and found themselves locked in his tower room. Although it was frightening to be trapped in his inner sanctum, a phrase which here means filthy room in which evil plans are devised, it turned out to be quite useful because they were able to read up on nuptial law and work their way out of their predicament. But here in Stefano's inner sanctum at Uncle Monty's house, all Violet could find were signs of uncleanliness. Somewhere Stefano must have left a trail of evidence that Violet could find and use to convince Mr. Poe, but where was it? Disheartened and afraid she'd spent too much time in Stefano's bedroom, Violet went quietly back downstairs. No, Mr. Poe was saying when she stopped to listen at the kitchen door again. Dr. Montgomery can't drive. He's dead. There must be a way to do this. I've told you over and over, Stefano said, and Violet could tell that he was growing angry. The easiest way for me to take the three children into town, while you follow with Dr. Lucafont and the corpse. What could be simpler? Perhaps you're right, Mr. Poe said with a sigh, and Violet hurried to the reptile room. Klaus, she cried, tell me you found something. I went to Stefano's room and there was nothing there to help us, and I think Stefano's going to get us alone in his car. Klaus smiled for an answer and began to read aloud from the book he was holding. The Mamadou Mal, he read, is one of the deadliest snakes in the hemisphere, noted for its strangulatory grip, used in conjunction with its deadly venom, giving its victims a tenebrous hue, which is ghastly to behold. Strangulatory? Conjunction? Tenebrous? Hue? Violet repeated. I have no idea what you're talking about. I didn't either, Klaus admitted, till I looked up some of the words. Strangulatory means having to do with strangling. In conjunction means together. Tenebrous means dark, and hue means color. So the Mama Dumal is noted for strangling people while it bites them, leaving their corpses dark with bruises. Stop, stop, Violet cried, covering her ears. I don't want to hear any more about what happened to Uncle Monty. You don't understand, Klaus said gently. That isn't what happened to Uncle Monty. But Dr. Lucafont said that it was the venom of the Mamba Dumal in Monty's veins, she said. I'm sure there was, Klaus said, but the snake didn't put it there. If it had, Uncle Monty's body would have been dark with bruises, but you and I remember that it was as pale as can be. Violet started to speak and then stopped, remembering the pale, pale face of Uncle Monty when they had discovered him. That's true, she said, but then how was he poisoned? Remember how Uncle Monty said that he kept the venoms of his poisonous snakes in test tubes to study them? Klaus said. I think Stefano took the venom and injected it into Uncle Monty. Really? Violet shuddered. That's awful. Ookpie, Sunny shrieked, apparently in agreement. When we tell Mr. Poe about this, Klaus said confidently, Stefano will be arrested for Uncle Monty's murder and sent to jail. No longer will he try to whisk us away to Peru or threaten us with knives or make us carry a suitcase or anything like that. Violet looked at her brother, her eyes wide with excitement. Suitcase, she said. His suitcase. What are you talking about? Klaus said quizzically, and Violet was about to explain when there was a knock on the door. Come in, Violet called, signaling to Sunny to not bite Mr. Poe as he walked in. I hope you were feeling a bit calmer, Mr. Poe said, looking at each of the children in turn and no longer entertaining the thought that Stefano is Count Olaf. When Mr. Poe used the word entertaining here, he meant thinking, rather than singing or dancing or putting on skits. Even if he's not Count Olaf, Klaus said carefully, we think he may be responsible for Uncle Monty's death. Nonsense, Mr. Poe exclaimed, as Violet shook her head at her brother. Uncle Monty's death was a terrible accident and nothing more. Klaus held up a book he was reading. But while you were in the kitchen, we were reading about snakes and... Reading about snakes, Mr. Poe said. I should think you would want to read about anything but snakes after what happened to Dr. Montgomery. But I found out something, Klaus said, that... It doesn't matter what you found out about snakes, Mr. Poe said, taking out a handkerchief. The bottlers waited while he coughed into it before returning it to his pocket. It doesn't matter, he said again, what you found out about snakes. Stefano doesn't want to know anything about snakes. He doesn't know anything about snakes. He told us that himself. But, Klaus said, but he stopped when he saw Violet. She shook her head at him again, just slightly. It was a signal, telling him not to say anything more to Mr. Poe. He looked at his sister, and then at Mr. Poe, and shut his mouth. Mr. Poe coughed slightly into his handkerchief and looked at his wristwatch. Now that we've settled that matter, there is the issue of riding in the car. I know that the three of you are eager to see the inside of a doctor's automobile, but we've discussed it over and over, and there's simply no way it can work. You three are going to ride with Stefano into town, while I will ride with Dr. Lucafont and your Uncle Monty. Stefano and Dr. Lucafont are unloading all the bags now, and we will leave in a few minutes. If you will excuse me, I have to call the Herpetological Society and tell them the bad news. Mr. Poe coughed once more into his handkerchief and left the room. Why didn't you want me to tell Mr. Poe what I read? Klaus asked Violet when he was sure that Mr. Poe was out of earshot, a word which here means close enough to hear him. Violet didn't answer. She was looking through the glass wall of the reptile room, watching Dr. Lucafont and Stefano walk past the snake-shaped hedges to Uncle Monty's jeep. Stefano opened the jeep door, and Dr. Lucafont began carrying suitcases out of the back in his strangely stiff hands. Violet, why didn't you want me to tell Mr. Poe what I read? When the adults come to fetch us, Violet said, ignoring Klaus's question, keep them in the reptile room until I get back. But how will I do that? Klaus said. Create a distraction, Violet answered impatiently, still looking out the window at the little pile of suitcases that Dr. Lucafont was making. What distraction? Klaus asked anxiously. How? For goodness sakes, Klaus, his older sister replied. You have read hundreds of books. Surely you must have read about creating a distraction. Klaus thought for a second. In order to win the Trojan War, he said, the ancient Greeks hid soldiers inside an enormous wooden horse. That was a sort of a distraction, but I don't have time to build a wooden horse. Then you'll have to think of something else, Violet said, and began to walk towards the door, still gazing out the window. Klaus and Sunny looked first at their sister and then out the window of the reptile room, in the direction that she was looking. It is remarkable that different people will have different thought when they are looking at the same thing. For when the two younger bottlers looked at the pile of suitcases, All they thought was that unless they did something quickly, they would end up alone in Uncle Monty's Jeep with Stefano. But from the way that Violet was staring as she walked out of the reptile room, she was obviously thinking something else. Klaus and Sunny could not imagine what it was, but somehow their sister had reached a different conclusion as she looked at her own brown suitcase, or perhaps the beige one that held Klaus's things, or the tiny gray one that was Sunny, or maybe the large black one with the shiny silver padlock that belonged to Stefano. Chapter 10. There's the hat up there. You can see this jumble down here. When you were very small, perhaps someone read you the insipid story, the word insipid here means not worth reading to someone, of the boy who cried wolf. A very dull boy, you may remember, cried wolf when there was no wolf, and the gullible villagers ran to rescue him, only to find the whole thing was a joke. Then he cried wolf when it wasn't a joke, and the villagers didn't come running, and the boy was eaten, and the story, thank goodness, was over. The story's moral, of course, ought to be never live somewhere where wolves are running around loose. But whoever read you the story probably told you that the moral was not to lie. This is an absurd moral, for you and I both know that sometimes not only is it good to lie, it is necessary to lie. For example, it was perfectly appropriate, after Violet left the reptile room, for Sunny to crawl over to the cage that held the incredible deadly viper, unlatch the cage, and began screaming as loudly as she could, even though there was nothing really wrong. There is another story concerning wolves that somebody has probably read to you, which is just as absurd. I'm talking about Little Red Riding Hood, an extremely unpleasant little girl who, like the boy who cried wolf, insisted on intruding on the territory of dangerous animals. You will recall that the wolf, after being treated very rudely by Little Red Riding Hood, ate the little girl's grandmother and put on her clothing as a disguise. This is an aspect of the story that is the most ridiculous, because one would think that even a little girl such as Little Red Riding Hood, could tell in the instance the difference between her grandmother and a wolf dressed in a nightgown and fuzzy slippers. If you know someone very well, like your grandmother or your babysitter, you will know when they are real and when they are fake. This is why, as Sunny began to scream, Violet and Klaus could tell immediately that her scream was absolutely fake. That scream is absolutely fake, Klaus said to himself from the other end of the reptile room. That scream is absolutely fake, Violet said to herself from the stairs as she went up to her room. My lord, something is terribly wrong, Mr. Poe said to himself from the kitchen where he was talking on the phone. Goodbye, he said into the receiver, hung up, and ran out of the kitchen to see what the matter was. What's the matter, Mr. Poe asked Stefano and Dr. Lucafont, who had finished unloading the suitcases and were entering the house. I heard some screams coming from the reptile room. I'm sure it's nothing, Stefano said. You know how children are. Dr. Lucafont said. We can't have another tragedy on our hands, Mr. Poe said, and rushed to the enormous door of the reptile room. Children, children! In here, Klaus cried. Come quickly. His voice was rough and low, and anyone who didn't know Klaus would think that he was very frightened. If you do know Klaus, however, you would know that when he was very frightened, his voice became tense and squeaky, as it did when he had discovered Uncle Monty's body. His voice became rough and low when he was trying not to laugh. It was a very good thing that Klaus managed not to laugh as Mr. Poe, Stefano, and Dr. Lucafont came into the reptile room. It would have spoiled everything. Sunny was laying down on the marble floor, her tiny arms and legs waving wildly as if she were trying to swim. Her facial expression was what made Klaus want to chuckle. Sunny's mouth was wide open, showing her 4 sharp teeth, and her eyes were blinking very rapidly. She was trying to appear extremely frightened, and if you didn't know Sunny, it would have seemed genuine. But Klaus did know Sunny, and knew that when she was very frightened, her face grew all puckered and silent, as it did when Stefano had threatened to cut off one of her toes. To anyone but Klaus, Sunny looked as if she were very frightened, particularly because of who she was with. For wrapped around Sunny's body was a snake as dark as a coal mine and as thick as a sewer pipe. It was looking at Sunny with green, shiny eyes, and its mouth was open as if it were about to bite her. The incredible deadly viper, Klaus cried. It's going to bite her. Klaus screamed, and Sunny opened her mouth and eyes even wider to seem even more scared. Dr. Lucafont's mouth opened too, and Klaus saw him start to say something, but he was unable to find the words. Stefano, who of course could have cared less about Sunny's well-being, at least looked surprised, but it was Mr. Poe who was absolutely panicked. There are 2 basic types of panicking. staying still and not saying a word, and leaping all over the place, babbling about anything that comes into your head. Mr. Poe was the leaping and babbling kind. Klaus and Sonny had never seen the banker move so quickly or talk in such a high-pitched voice. "Goodness!" he cried. "Golly! Good God! Blessed Allah! Zeus and Hera! Mary and Joseph! Nathaniel Hawthorne! Don't touch her! Grab her! Move closer! Run away! Don't move! Kill the snake! Leave it alone! Give it some food! Don't let it bite her! Lure the snake away! Here, Snaky! Here, Snaky, Snaky!" The incredible deadly viper listened patiently to Mr. Poe's speech, never taking its eyes off Sonny, and when Mr. Poe paused to cough into his handkerchief, it leaned over and bit Sonny on the chin, right where it had bitten her when the two friends had first met. Klaus tried not to grin, but Dr. Lucafont gasped. Stefano stared, and Mr. Poe began leaping and babbling again. "It's bitten her!" he cried. "It bit her! It bitted her! It bited her! Calm down. Get moving. Call an ambulance. Call the police. Call a scientist. Call my wife. This is terrible. This is awful. This is ghastly. This is phantasmagorical. This is nothing to worry about," Stefano interrupted smoothly. "What do you mean, nothing to worry about?" Mr. Poe said incredulously. "Sonny was just bitten by a... What's the name of the snake, Klaus?" "The incredible deadly viper," Klaus answered promptly. "The incredible deadly viper!" Mr. Poe repeated, pointing to the snake as it held onto Sonny's chin with its teeth. Sonny gave another fake shriek of fear. How can you say it's nothing to worry about?" "Because the incredible deadly viper is completely harmless," Stefano said. "Calm yourself, Mr. Poe. The snake's name is a misnomer that Dr. Montgomery created for his own amusement." "Are you sure?" Mr. Poe said. His voice got a little lower, and he moved a bit more slowly as he began to calm down. "Oh, I'm sure," Stefano said, and Klaus recognized a look on his face when he remembered from living at Count Olaf's. It was a look of sheer vanity, a word which here means Count Olaf thinking that he's the most incredible person who ever lived. When the Baudelaire orphans had been under Olaf's care, he had often acted this way, always happy to show off his skills, whether on stage with his atrocious theater company or up in his tower room making nasty plans. Stefano smiled and continued to speak to Mr. Poe, eager to show off. "The snake is perfectly harmless, friendly even. I read up on the incredible deadly viper and many other snakes in the library section of the Reptile Room, as well as Dr. Montgomery's private papers." Dr. Lucafont cleared his throat. Boss," he said. "Don't interrupt me, Dr. Lucafont," Stefano said. "I studied the books on all the major species, looked carefully at sketches and charts, and I took careful notes and looked them over each night before I went to sleep. If I may say so, I consider myself to be quite the expert on snakes." "Aha!" Sonny cried, disentangling herself from the incredible deadly viper. "Sonny, you're unharmed," Mr. Poe cried. "Aha!" Sonny cried again, pointing at Stefano. The incredible deadly viper blinked its green eyes triumphantly. Mr. Poe looked at Klaus, puzzled. "What does your sister mean by aha?" he asked. Klaus sighed. He felt sometimes as if he had spent half his life explaining things to Mr. Poe. "By aha," he said, "she means 1 minute. Stefano claims that he knows nothing more about snakes. The next he claims he's an expert. By aha, she means Stefano has been lying to us. And by aha, she means we finally exposed his dishonesty to you. By aha, she means aha." Chapter 11. Let's see the lamp here. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, Violet was upstairs surveying her bedroom with a critical eye. She took a deep breath and then tied her hair in a ribbon to keep it out of her eyes. As you and I and everyone who is familiar with Violet know, when she ties her hair back like that, it is because she needs to think up an invention. And right now she needed to think of one very quickly. Violet had realized when her brother had talked about Stefano ordering them to carry a suitcase into the house that the evidence she had been looking for was undoubtedly in that very suitcase. And now while her siblings were distracted the adults in the Reptile Room, it would be her only opportunity to open the suitcase and retrieve proof of Stefano's evil plot. But her aching shoulder was a reminder that she couldn't simply open the suitcase. It was locked, with a lock as shining as Stefano's scheming eyes. I confess that if I were in Violet's place, with only a few minutes to open a locked suitcase, instead of on the deck of my friend Belia's yacht, writing this down, I probably would have given up hope. I would have sunk to the floor of the bedroom and pounded my fist against the carpet, wondering why in the world's life was so unfair and filled with so many inconveniences. Luckily for the Baudelaires, however, Violet was made of sterner stuff, and she took a good look around her bedroom for anything that might help her. There wasn't much in the way of inventing materials. Violet longed for a good room in which to invent things, filled with wires and gears and all of the necessary equipment to invent really top-notch devices. Uncle Monty was, in fact, in possession of many of these supplies, but to Violet's frustration, as she thought of this, they were located in the Reptile Room. She looked at the pieces of butcher tape tacked to the wall, where she had hoped to sketch out inventions as she lived in Uncle Monty's house. The trouble had begun so quickly that Violet only had a few scribblings on one of the sheets, which she had written by the light of the floor lamp her first night there. Violet's eyes traveled to the floor lamp as she remembered that evening, and when she reached the electric socket, she had an idea. We all know, of course, that we should never, ever, 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 ever fiddle around in any way with electronic devices. Never. There are two reasons for this. One is that you can get electrocuted, which is not only deadly, but also very unpleasant, and the other is that you are not Violet Baudelaire, one of the few people in the world who know how to handle such things. And even Violet was very careful and nervous as she unplugged the lamp and took a long look at the plug itself. It might work. Hoping that Klaus and Sunny were continuing to stall the adult successfully, Violet wiggled the two prongs of the plug this way and that until they came loose from their plastic casing. She now had two small metal strips. Then Violet took out one of the thumbtacks from the butcher paper and let the paper curl down the wall as if it were lazy. With a sharp end of the tack, she poked and prodded the two pieces of metal till one was hooked around the other, and then forced the thumbtack between the two pieces so the sharp end stuck straight out. The result looked like a piece of metal that you might not notice if it lay in the street. But what Violet made was the word crude here means roughly made at the last minute rather than rude or ill-mannered, lockpick. Lockpicks, as you probably know, are devices that work as if they were proper keys, but are usually used by bad guys to rob houses or escape from jail. But this was one of the rare times when the lockpick was being used by a good guy, Violet Baudelaire. Violet walked quickly back down the stairs, holding her lockpick in one hand and crossing her fingers with the other. She tiptoed past the enormous door of the Reptile Room and hoped that her absence would not be noticed as she slipped outside. Deliberately averting her eyes from Dr. Lucafont's car to avoid catching even a glimpse of Uncle Monty's body, the eldest Baudelaire walked towards the pile of suitcases. She looked first at the old ones belonging to the Baudelaire. Those suitcases contained, she remembered, lots of ugly, itchy clothes that Mrs. Poe had bought for them soon after their parents died. For a few seconds, Violet found herself staring at the suitcases, remembering how effortless her life had been before all this trouble had been set upon them, and how surprising it was to find herself in such a miserable circumstance now. This may not be surprising to us because we know how disastrous the lives of the Baudelaire orphans are, but Violet's misfortunes were constantly surprising her, and it took her a minute to push through the thoughts of their situation and to concentrate on what she had to do. She knelt down to get a closer look at Stefano's suitcase, held the shiny silver padlock in one hand and took a deep breath, then stuck the lockpick into the keyhole. It went inside, but when she tried to turn it around, it scarcely budged, only scraped a little inside the keyhole. It needed to move more smoothly or it never would work. Violet took her lockpick out and wet it with her mouth, grimacing at the stale taste of the metal. Then she stuck the lockpick in the keyhole again and tried to move it. It wiggled slightly, and then it laid still. Violet took the lockpick out and thought very hard, retying her hair in the ribbon. As she cleared the hair from her eyes, though she felt a sudden prickle on her skin. It was unpleasant and familiar. It was the feeling of being watched. She looked quickly behind her, but saw only the snake-shaped hedges on the lawn. She looked to the side and saw only the driveway leading down to Lousy Lane. But then she looked straight ahead, through the glass walls of the Reptile Room. It had never occurred to her that the people could see through the Reptile Room walls as clearly as they could see out, but when she looked up, Violet could see, through the cages of reptile, the figure of Mr. Poe leaping up and down excitedly. You and I, of course, know that Mr. Poe was panicking over Sunny and the incredible deadly viper, but all Violet knew was whatever ruse her siblings had devised was still working. The prickle on her skin was not explained, however, until she looked a little closer, just to the right of Mr. Poe, and saw that Stefano was looking right back at her. Her mouth fell open in surprise and panic. She knew that any second now Stefano would invent an excuse to leave the reptile room and come and find her, and she hadn't even opened the suitcase. Quickly, she had to find some way to make her lockpick work. She looked down at the damp gravel of the driveway and up at the dim, yellowish afternoon sun. She looked at her own hand, smudged with dust from picking apart the electric plug, and that's when she thought of something. Jumping to her feet, Violet sprinted back into the house as if Stefano were already after her and pushed her way through the door into the kitchen. Shoving a chair to the floor in her haste, she grabbed a bar of soap from the dripping sink. She rubbed the slippery substance carefully over her lockpit till the entire device had a thin, slick coating. Her heart pounding in her chest, she ran back outside, taking a hurried look through the walls of the reptile room. Stefano was saying something to Mr. Poe. He was bragging about his expertise of snakes, but Violet had no way of knowing that. And Violet took this moment to kneel down and stick the lockpick back into the keyhole of the padlock. It spun quickly all the way around and then snapped in two, right in her hand. There was a faint sputter of sound as one half fell to the grass, the other one sticking in the lock like a jagged tooth. Her lockpick was destroyed. Violet closed her eyes for a moment in despair and then pulled herself to her feet, using the suitcase to get her balance. When she put her hand on the suitcase, however, the padlock swung open and the case tipped over and spilled everything all over the ground. Violet fell back down in surprise. Somehow, as the lockpick turned, it must have unstuck the lock. Sometimes, even the most unfortunate of lives, there occurs a moment or two of good fortune. It is very difficult, experts have told us, to find a needle in a haystack, which is why needle in a haystack has become a rather hackneyed phrase meaning something that is difficult to find. The reason it is difficult to find a needle in a haystack, of course, is that of all the things in a haystack, the needle is only one of them. However, if you were looking for anything in a haystack, it wouldn't be difficult at all, because once you started sifting through the haystack, you would most certainly find something. Hay, of course, but also bugs and dirt and a few farming tools, and maybe even a man who escaped from prison and was hiding there. When Violet searched through the contents of Stefano's suitcase, it was more like looking for anything in a haystack, because she didn't know exactly what she wanted to find. Therefore, it was fairly easy to find useful items of evidence. A glass vial with a sealed rubber cap, as one might find in a scientific laboratory, a syringe with a sharp needle, like the one your doctor uses to give you shots, a small bunch of folded papers, a card laminated in plastic, a powder puff, and a small hand mirror. Even though she knew she only had a few more minutes, Violet separated these items from the smelly clothes and the bottle of wine that were also in the suitcase, and looked at all of her evidence very carefully, concentrating on each item as if they were small parts out of which she was going to make a machine. And in a way, they were. Violet Baudelaire needed to arrange these pieces of evidence to defeat Stefano's evil plan and bring justice and peace into the lives of the Baudelaire orphans for the first time since their parents had perished in the terrible fire. Violet gazed at each piece of evidence, thinking very hard, and before too long her face lit up in the way it always did when the pieces of something were fit together properly, and the machine worked just the way it should. Chapter 12. We're going to end here for today and pick up with Chapter 12 for tomorrow, but I will give you a little glance at the picture. Once again, my name is Sarah Mari. I'm one of the librarians at Portland Public Library in Portland, Maine, and we've been reading from The Reptile Room, the second book in the series of unfortunate events, written by Lemony Snicket, illustrated by Brett Helquist, and published by Harper Collins Publishers. I hope to see you tomorrow, where we'll finish the story. Bye.